fog rolled thick through Whitechapel's narrow streets like a living shroud, swallowing gaslight and muffling the echo of hurried footsteps on wet cobblestone. November 1873 had brought London the heaviest mists in memory, and within that grey veil something moved with purpose through the maze of tenements and alleyways. Inspector Caldwell pressed his back against the damp brick wall listening. The whisper of fabric against stone, the soft scrape of leather on pavement, then silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like cotton. His breath formed pale clouds that dissolved instantly into the surrounding darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight with hollow, mournful notes. For 3 months, the killer had used London's infamous fog as accomplice and shield. 7 victims, 7 families left to grieve, 7 investigations that led nowhere but deeper into the city's grey labyrinth. The newspapers had dubbed the perpetrator the Fog Killer, and Scotland Yard's finest minds remained baffled. Tonight Caldwell had ventured alone into the killer's hunting ground, following a pattern only he had noticed. The fog began to thin slightly, revealing the outline of a familiar doorway, and the inspector realised with growing unease that he might have walked directly into the predator's web. Chapter 1. In the Shadow of the Thames. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time to an era when gaslight flickered against brick and mortar, when coal smoke mingled with river mist, and when London's streets held secrets darker than any shadow cast by cathedral spire or factory chimney. Tonight, we journey to the autumn of 1873, when fear walked the cobblestones of Whitechapel cloaked in fog and silence. Wherever you find yourself listening tonight, perhaps tucked beneath warm blankets as rain patters against your window, or seated by lamplight while the world sleeps beyond your walls, know that you have found refuge in this moment of quiet contemplation. The hour grows late, and we shall spend it together exploring the mysteries that history has left unsolved. If you find comfort in these tales from centuries past, I would be most grateful if you would consider subscribing to this humble channel. Each subscription helps our little corner of the night to grow, allowing these forgotten stories to find new listeners who, like yourself, seek the gentle companionship of history's whispers. Now, let us step through time's veil and walk the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, where gaslight struggled against perpetual twilight, and where something moved through the mist that defied all understanding. The autumn of 1873 descended upon London like a grey benediction, wrapping the sprawling metropolis in veils of mist that seemed to rise from the very stones themselves. The Thames rolled dark and heavy between its embankments, carrying the weight of industrial progress and human ambition downstream toward the sea, while above its waters the great city breathed through 10,000 chimneys, each exhaling its own contribution to the perpetual shroud that had become London's defining characteristic. In the narrow streets of Whitechapel, where poverty pressed close against the better districts like a persistent supplicant, the fog took on an almost corporeal presence. It slipped between buildings with the fluid grace of spilled quicksilver, pulled in doorways like accumulated shadow, and transformed familiar thoroughfares into alien landscapes where sound travelled strangely, and distance became meaningless. The residents of these cramped quarters had grown accustomed to the mist's constant presence, navigating by memory and instinct through streets that daylight rarely fully revealed. But in those autumn months something else moved through the fog with purpose and malevolent intelligence. Something that understood the mist not as obstacle but as ally, transforming London's atmospheric peculiarity into the perfect hunting ground. The newspapers, ever hungry for sensation that might sell another penny's worth of ink and paper, had christened this unseen menace the Fog Killer, though Scotland Yard's finest investigators remained as lost in their pursuit as any common citizen wandering the enshrouded streets. Detective Inspector Horatio Caldwell stood at his office window in the pre-dawn hours of November 13th, watching the fog swirl past the glass like smoke from some vast, invisible fire. At 42 years of age, Caldwell possessed the weathered features and penetrating gaze of a man who had spent 2 decades studying the darker impulses of human nature. His hair, once a rich brown, now showed streaks of premature silver at the temples, a testament to sleepless nights and the accumulated weight of unsolved cases that haunted his professional consciousness. The inspector's office reflected the methodical nature of its occupant. Files lay arranged in precise stacks across his desk, each containing witness statements, coroner's reports, and detailed sketches of crime scenes that had yielded precious few clues. Maps of Whitechapel covered one wall, marked with coloured pins that traced the killer's movements through the labyrinthine streets with disturbing precision. 3 months of investigation had produced this careful documentation, yet the perpetrator remained as elusive as morning mist touched by sunrise. Below his window, the street lamps struggled against the encroaching fog, their yellow flames creating small islands of illumination that seemed to float in an ocean of grey. Occasional figures moved through this twilight world, night workers heading home, early risers beginning their daily labours, and those unfortunate souls for whom the streets provided the only shelter available in a city that grew more expensive with each passing year. Caldwell's thoughts turned to the 7 victims whose lives had been claimed by the fog killer's methodical violence. Each had been discovered in the early morning hours, when the mist hung thickest and the city lay suspended between night and day. Each had been found in locations that suggested intimate knowledge of Whitechapel's hidden pathways and forgotten corners. Most disturbing of all, each scene bore evidence of careful planning and execution that spoke to a criminal intelligence both patient and utterly ruthless. The first victim, Mary Pemberton, had been discovered on August 23rd behind the ruins of an old warehouse that had burned the previous winter. A seamstress by trade, she had been walking home from a late evening gathering at her church when she vanished into the fog. Her body was found 12 hours later, positioned with an almost ceremonial care that suggested the killer viewed murder as a form of artistic expression. Thomas Hartwell, a dock worker returning from his shift, had disappeared 3 days later. His remains were discovered in an alley so narrow that investigating officers had been forced to enter single file, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on brick walls that seemed to press inward like the sides of a closing tomb. The precision with which he had been killed spoke to someone with anatomical knowledge, though whether gained through medical training or darker experience remained unclear. The subsequent victims followed this same pattern of careful selection and methodical execution. Sarah Mills, a flower seller who worked the markets near London Bridge. Peter Ashford, an elderly man who earned his living sweeping the steps of businesses in the financial district. Elizabeth Crenshaw, a widow who took in washing to support her invalid daughter. Each had vanished during the fog-heavy hours when London became a different city entirely, transformed from a bustling centre of commerce into something more primitive and dangerous. The killer's choice of victims suggested no clear pattern based on social class or occupation. The wealthy merchant and the common labourer were equally at risk, bound together only by their shared misfortune of walking alone through the mist-shrouded streets during the hunting hours. This democratic approach to violence made the crimes even more terrifying to London citizens, who realised that wealth and position offered no protection against an adversary who struck without warning or apparent motive. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, the police surgeon assigned to examine the remains, had provided detailed reports that only deepened the mystery. A man of science who approached his grim duties with clinical detachment, Blackwood possessed a reputation for thoroughness that extended throughout Scotland Yard. His findings painted a picture of systematic violence executed with surgical precision, though he steadfastly refused to speculate about the killer's identity or possible background. The wounds suggest familiarity with human anatomy, Blackwood had reported during one of their consultations, his voice maintaining the neutral tone he employed when discussing matters that might otherwise disturb a less experienced observer. Yet there are inconsistencies that prevent me from concluding we seek someone with formal medical training. The cuts are precise, yes, but they follow no pattern that would be taught in any legitimate institution of learning. The doctor's reports included detailed drawings that Caldwell studied with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. Each illustration revealed new mysteries while solving none of the existing ones. The killer possessed enough anatomical knowledge to work with deadly efficiency, yet made deliberate choices that seemed designed more to prolong suffering than to achieve quick results. This suggested a personality that derived satisfaction from the act of killing itself rather than merely its outcome. Sergeant Frederick Morrison, Caldwell's most trusted subordinate, had compiled extensive interviews with residents of the affected districts. A methodical man whose attention to detail matched that of his superior, Morrison possessed the rare ability to encourage frightened witnesses to share information they might otherwise withhold. His reports revealed a community living in constant fear, where neighbours regarded each other with suspicion, and the approach of evening brought an almost palpable tension to the narrow streets. They speak of hearing footsteps that follow their own, Morrison had reported during one of their morning briefings. Sounds that stop when they stop, resume when they resume. But when they turn to look, the fog reveals nothing but empty pavement and shadow. Some claim to have glimpsed a figure moving parallel to their path, always just at the edge of visibility, never quite solid enough to identify, but substantial enough to inspire terror. These accounts of a pursuing presence had become common among Whitechapel's residents, who developed elaborate strategies for avoiding solitary travel during the fog-heavy hours. Merchants arranged their schedules to avoid early morning deliveries. Workers formed groups for mutual protection during their journeys to and from employment. Even the local clergy shortened their evening services, recognizing that spiritual comfort offered little protection against an adversary who used the mist itself as weapon and concealment. The local newspapers had embraced the story with the enthusiasm typical of publications competing for readership in an increasingly literate society. Headlines grew more sensational with each passing week, while editorial writers demanded action from authorities who seemed powerless to halt the mounting casualties. "The fog killer strikes again," proclaimed the Morning Chronicle after the discovery of the sixth victim. Scotland Yard, baffled by Whitechapel terror, announced the Evening Standard, accompanied by artistic renderings that bore little resemblance to the actual crime scenes, but succeeded in capturing the public imagination. These journalistic accounts, while often inaccurate in their details, had succeeded in transforming a series of localised crimes into a matter of citywide concern. Letters arrived daily at Scotland Yard from citizens offering theories, reporting suspicious observations, and demanding increased protection for their neighbourhoods. Caldwell read each communication personally, knowing that somewhere within this flood of correspondence might lie the crucial detail that would finally illuminate their investigation. The inspector's personal study of the crime scenes had revealed subtle patterns that existed at the very edge of detection. Each location possessed multiple routes of approach and escape, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge of Whitechapel's maze-like street system. Each site offered excellent concealment during the crucial moments when violence was committed, indicating advanced reconnaissance and careful planning. Most significantly, each scene lay within easy walking distance of the Thames, where evidence might be disposed of in waters that carried secrets downstream toward the sea. This proximity to the river had led Caldwell to spend considerable time studying the patterns of fog formation along the waterfront. He had consulted with meteorological experts from the Royal Observatory, learning how atmospheric conditions combined with industrial emissions and river moisture to create the dense mist that had become London's most distinctive characteristic. The fog, he learned, was predictable in its general patterns but subject to local variations that might be anticipated by someone with sufficient experience and observation. Dr. Blackwood had suggested that the killer might possess some form of medical or scientific training, though he admitted this conclusion was based more on intuition than concrete evidence. The precision of the wounds suggested steady hands and clear understanding of human anatomy, yet certain aspects of the crimes defied explanation through conventional medical knowledge. The positioning of the bodies, for instance, seemed to follow some private logic that bore no relation to any legitimate field of study. The investigation had revealed no useful physical evidence despite the most thorough examination of each crime scene. The killer left no footprints that could be distinguished from those of countless other pedestrians who used the same pathways daily. No fabric fibres, no personal effects, no tools or weapons were ever recovered. It was as though the crimes were committed by someone who understood exactly what evidence might betray their identity and took elaborate precautions to avoid leaving such traces. Witness accounts proved equally frustrating in their vagueness. The fog that provided the killer with perfect concealment also prevented clear observation by potential witnesses. Residents reported hearing sounds, footsteps, brief conversations, occasionally what might have been struggles. But visual confirmation remained impossible. Several witnesses claimed to have seen a tall figure moving through the mist, but descriptions varied so dramatically that they might have referred to different individuals entirely. The temporal pattern of the crimes had initially suggested someone with irregular working hours or no fixed employment. Each murder occurred during the pre-dawn hours when legitimate traffic on the streets reached its minimum, yet the timing was never precisely identical. This variation suggested either careful planning designed to avoid establishing a predictable schedule, or opportunistic behaviour that struck when circumstances proved most favourable. Caldwell's analysis of the killer's movement patterns had revealed a sophisticated understanding of police procedures and investigative techniques. The crimes occurred in a sequence that prevented the establishment of clear geographical patterns while maintaining access to the concealment provided by London's densest fog formations. Each location was selected to minimise the possibility of witness observation while maximising the killer's ability to approach and escape undetected. The inspector had begun to suspect that their adversary possessed not only anatomical knowledge and familiarity with Whitechapel's geography, but also understanding of police methodology that suggested previous contact with law enforcement procedures. This possibility was deeply disturbing, implying that the killer might be someone within their own professional community, or at least someone with access to information about investigative techniques. As dawn approached on this 13th day of November, Caldwell prepared to venture once again into the fog-shrouded streets where 7 lives had been claimed, and where an 8th victim might already be selected. His investigation had revealed much about the killer's methods and capabilities, yet the perpetrator's identity remained as obscure as ever. Tonight, however, the inspector carried with him a new theory, based on careful analysis of the crime patterns, and his growing understanding of how the fog killer used London's perpetual mist as both weapon and shield. The morning light struggled against the fog as Caldwell descended to the street, beginning another day in his pursuit of an adversary who moved through Victorian London like a figure from nightmares, leaving behind only questions wrapped in shadow and silence. Chapter 2. The Science of Shadows. The gaslight flickered against the November fog as Dr. Elias Whitmore adjusted his spectacles and examined the peculiar marks etched into the victim's pale skin. The mortuary beneath Guy's Hospital held the chill of winter in its stone walls, and the scent of carbolic acid mingled with something far more unsettling in the stagnant air. 7 bodies had passed through these chambers in the span of 3 months, each bearing the same inexplicable wounds that defied conventional understanding of violence. Whitmore had served as police surgeon for nearly 2 decades, witnessing the full catalogue of human cruelty that London streets could produce. The usual stabbings and strangulations, the domestic brutalities that filled his ledger books with dreary regularity, all followed patterns that medical science could readily explain. Yet these 7 cases presented characteristics that challenged every principle he had learned during his years at the Royal College of Surgeons. The latest victim, a seamstress named Margaret Thornfield, lay beneath the pale sheet with an expression of profound tranquillity that seemed almost supernatural in its serenity. Her hands were folded across her chest, as if she had simply chosen to rest, and no signs of struggle marked her clothing or flesh. The only evidence of foul play rested in 3 precise puncture wounds, arranged in a perfect triangle just below her left collarbone, each penetrating exactly 2 inches deep according to his careful measurements. Inspector Caldwell entered the mortuary chamber with the measured steps of a man who had spent the previous night walking through fog-shrouded streets without rest. His coat carried the dampness of London's perpetual mist, and shadows beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless hours devoted to pursuing phantoms through the city's maze of narrow passages. The inspector had developed an almost mystical belief in the power of direct observation, convinced that the killer's pattern would eventually reveal itself to anyone willing to immerse themselves completely in the hunt. "The same marks," Whitmore observed quietly, pulling back the sheet to reveal the 3 wounds that had become the killer's signature. Triangular arrangement, identical depth, no defensive injuries whatsoever. It defies every principle of criminal violence I have encountered in my career. The doctor's voice carried the weight of professional bewilderment as he gestured toward the body with his silver-handled probe. Each victim had been discovered in a state of apparent peaceful repose, positioned with careful attention to dignity and respect. No torn clothing, no bruises, no indication that they had fought against their attacker or even recognized the approach of death. The killer seemed to possess some supernatural ability to render victims completely passive before delivering the fatal wounds. Caldwell studied the markings with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The 3 punctures formed an equilateral triangle with mathematical precision, suggesting either remarkable anatomical knowledge or the use of some specialized instrument designed for this specific purpose. Scotland Yard's finest investigators had consulted with weapons experts, medical professionals, and even practitioners of the occult sciences, yet none could identify any existing tool capable of producing such wounds. "The positioning troubles me more than the wounds themselves," the inspector murmured, walking slowly around the examination table. Each victim discovered lying in perfect alignment with cardinal directions, hands arranged identically, personal effects organized with meticulous care. This level of ritual behavior suggests a mind operating according to some internal logic we cannot yet comprehend. The fog outside pressed against the mortuary windows like grey cotton, muffling the sounds of London's eternal activity and creating an atmosphere of supernatural isolation within the stone chamber. November's mists had grown thicker with each passing week, transforming familiar streets into alien landscapes where ordinary citizens lost their way within blocks of their own homes. The killer had chosen the perfect season for hunting, using nature's own veil to move unseen through the city's labyrinthine passages. Whitmore opened his leather-bound notebook and consulted the detailed records he had compiled during 3 months of increasingly puzzling examinations. Each victim's age ranged between 25 and 35 years, all possessed similar physical builds and colouring, all worked in occupations that required them to traverse London streets during evening hours. Seamstresses, flower sellers, laundresses, domestic servants returning from their employers' homes after dark. The killer had demonstrated remarkable patience in selecting prey that matched specific criteria. "Notice the complete absence of blood around the wounds," the doctor continued, indicating the 3 punctures with his probe. "The bleeding appears to have ceased almost immediately after penetration, as if circulation stopped instantaneously. I have never encountered anything resembling this phenomenon in 2 decades of forensic examination." The inspector leaned closer to examine the wounds under the flickering gaslight. Each puncture appeared clean and precise, edges showing no tearing or irregular trauma that might indicate struggle or haste. The killer possessed either extraordinary skill with edged weapons or access to instruments unknown to conventional medicine. Several prominent physicians had suggested the possibility of some exotic poison that could render victims unconscious while preserving the appearance of peaceful death. Beyond the physical evidence, The killer's choice of locations demonstrated intimate knowledge of London's geography and the predictable movements of its working population. Each body had been discovered in areas where fog naturally accumulated due to the intersection of narrow streets and the Thames's perpetual moisture. The murderer seemed to understand the city's atmospheric patterns with the precision of a meteorologist, timing attacks to coincide with periods of maximum concealment. Caldwell had spent countless hours walking these same routes, attempting to reconstruct the killer's methodology and identify potential future hunting grounds. The fog responded to wind patterns, temperature variations, and the complex interaction between the river's moisture and London's maze of brick and stone. Certain streets remained shrouded long after others cleared, creating corridors of invisibility that a knowledgeable predator could navigate with complete confidence. The newspapers have begun calling him the Fog Killer, the inspector observed, his voice carrying a mixture of frustration and professional respect for the murderer's capabilities. The name captures something essential about these crimes. This individual has formed a partnership with London's weather, using natural phenomena as accomplice and shield. The mortuary's silence was broken only by the steady drip of condensation from pipes that ran along the ceiling, marking time with mechanical precision, while two men contemplated the mystery of death without violence. Each victim's face retained an expression of absolute tranquility that seemed to mock conventional understanding of murder's brutal reality. Whatever method the killer employed left no trace of fear, pain, or recognition of impending doom. Whitmore had consulted with colleagues throughout London's medical community, sharing detailed descriptions of the wounds and their accompanying circumstances. Physicians who specialized in tropical diseases suggested exotic toxins imported from colonial territories, while alienists proposed theories involving hypnotic suggestion and psychological manipulation. Yet none of these explanations could account for the mathematical precision of the wounds or the complete absence of struggle in every case. The killer's knowledge extended beyond anatomy and atmospheric conditions to encompass the complex social patterns that governed London's working population. Each victim had been selected during moments of maximum vulnerability and minimum visibility, snatched from the city's protective embrace during those liminal hours when fog transformed familiar territory into alien landscape. The murderer possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify solitary figures moving through the mist and approach them without triggering alarm. "Consider the timing," Caldwell continued. Consulting his own notebook filled with careful observations about weather patterns and victim locations, each attack occurred during periods when fog density reached maximum thickness, usually between 10 o'clock and midnight when most citizens had sought shelter indoors. The killer waits for ideal conditions, demonstrating patience that speaks to careful planning rather than opportunistic violence. The inspector had developed a theory that the murderer possessed some professional connection to London's atmospheric sciences, or perhaps worked in one of the city's many meteorological stations. The timing of attacks showed such precise correlation with weather patterns that mere coincidence seemed impossible. Someone was monitoring fog formation with scientific precision and using that knowledge to coordinate a campaign of terror. Outside the mortuary windows, the November fog continued its relentless advance through London streets, transforming gaslight into ethereal halos and reducing visibility to mere feet in any direction. The city's inhabitants had grown accustomed to these seasonal mists, accepting them as natural consequence of their proximity to the Thames and the peculiar geography that trapped moisture between rows of closely built structures. Few realized how completely the fog could conceal predatory movement, or how thoroughly it could isolate victims from potential assistance. Whitmore closed his notebook and covered the victim's face with practiced gentleness, completing another examination that raised more questions than answers. 7 deaths, 7 families left to mourn incomprehensible loss, 7 investigations that seemed to dissolve into grey uncertainty like footprints in heavy mist. The killer had achieved something approaching supernatural status in the public imagination, becoming a legend whispered in taverns and discussed in drawing rooms throughout the city. The two men stood in contemplative silence, surrounded by the mortuary's stone walls and the steady presence of death that had become their shared obsession. Tomorrow would bring fresh fog, fresh opportunities for the killer to select another victim, fresh challenges for those attempting to prevent additional tragedies. The hunt would continue through London's grey labyrinth, guided by incomplete clues and shadowy theories that seemed to evaporate whenever examined too closely. As midnight approached, the fog outside began to shift and thicken, responding to atmospheric pressures that would soon transform the city into perfect hunting ground once again. Somewhere in the mist, the killer waited with infinite patience, watching and planning the next move in a deadly game where only one player understood the rules. Chapter 3. The Pattern in the Mist. The gaslight flickered against the November darkness as Inspector Caldwell made his way through the labyrinthine streets of Whitechapel, his footsteps echoing hollow against the wet cobblestones. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the skeletal outlines of tenement buildings rising like tombstones against the starless sky. 3 weeks had passed since the 7th victim had been discovered, and still the pattern remained elusive, dancing at the edges of his understanding like shadows cast by candlelight. In his coat pocket, the inspector carried a leather journal, its pages filled with meticulous observations gathered during countless nights spent walking these same streets. Each entry recorded the precise atmospheric conditions, the density of the fog, the direction of the wind, the temperature as measured by the old thermometer he had inherited from his father. What had emerged from this careful documentation was something that chilled him more thoroughly than the November air itself. The fog killer struck only when the mist reached a particular thickness, when visibility dropped to mere yards, and the city transformed into an alien landscape of muffled sounds and ghostly shapes. But more disturbing still was the geographic precision of the attacks. Each victim had been found within a carefully defined area, as if the killer possessed an intimate knowledge of Whitechapel's most obscure passages and forgotten courtyards. Caldwell paused beneath the pale circle of a street lamp, withdrawing his journal to study the map he had sketched on its final pages. 7 red marks indicated the locations where bodies had been discovered, and when connected by pencil lines, they formed an almost perfect spiral pattern, centered on the old Saxon church that had stood in this quarter for nearly 8 centuries. The realization had come to him 3 days prior, while studying the evidence by candlelight in his modest lodgings, and since then sleep had proven as elusive as the killer himself. The Church of St Dunstan had survived the Great Fire, the Plague Years, and countless generations of London's forgotten poor. Its bell tower rose above the surrounding tenements like an ancient finger pointing toward heaven, though heaven seemed particularly distant on these fog-shrouded nights. The building served a congregation of perhaps 50 souls, mostly elderly women who had lived in the parish their entire lives, led by Father Whitmore, a gentleman in his 70s whose sermons spoke more of mercy than of judgment. Yet something about the church drew Caldwell's attention with increasing insistence. Perhaps it was the way the fog seemed to cling more thickly around its weathered stone walls, or how the killer's victims had been found at locations that formed concentric circles around the building. The inspector had begun to suspect that the murderer was using the church as a navigational anchor, moving outward from its familiar spire in carefully calculated distances. The November air carried the scent of coal smoke and dampness, mixed with the less pleasant odours that haunted London's poorest quarters. Caldwell pulled his coat closer as he approached the church grounds, noting how the mist swirled around the iron fence that enclosed the small cemetery. Weathered headstones emerged from the fog like ancient sentinels, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of London rain. As he pushed open the cemetery gate, its hinges protesting with a sound like winter wind through bare branches, the inspector reflected on what he knew of the killer's methods. Each victim had been discovered in a state that suggested intimate knowledge of human anatomy, positioned with a precision that spoke of ritual rather than random violence. The wounds themselves told a story of careful study, as if the perpetrator possessed the training of a surgeon, or perhaps a veterinary practitioner. The fog thickened as Caldwell moved deeper into the cemetery, transforming the familiar world into something from a fever dream. Headstones loomed and vanished like ships passing in a harbour, their carved angels and crosses appearing momentarily in the pale light before dissolving back into the grey void. The inspector's breath formed small clouds that merged instantly with the surrounding mist, and he found himself moving more slowly, each footstep placed with deliberate care on the uneven ground. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of a church bell tolling the quarter hour, its bronze voice muffled by the thick air until it seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself. Caldwell paused, consulting his pocket watch by the dim light of a nearby street lamp. 11:30. The killer's previous attacks had all occurred between midnight and 2 in the morning, during what the inspector had come to think of as the deepest hours of the fog. The cemetery extended further than Caldwell had realised, its boundaries lost in the swirling mist. Ancient yew trees stood like monuments to forgotten centuries, their twisted branches reaching into the grey void above. Beneath one such tree, the inspector discovered a weathered bench, its wooden surface slick with moisture. He settled onto it, withdrawing his journal once more to review his observations by the faint illumination of the distant street lamps. The pattern remained consistent across all 7 murders. Each victim had been discovered within 24 hours of a particularly dense fog, always in locations that offered multiple escape routes through Whitechapel's maze of alleys and courts. The positioning of the bodies suggested someone familiar not only with anatomy, but with the specific geography of this ancient quarter of London. Most tellingly, each victim had been found with a small sprig of rosemary placed carefully upon their chest, a detail the authorities had managed to keep from the newspapers. Rosemary for remembrance, as the old saying went. But remembrance of what? Caldwell had spent considerable time researching the herb's symbolic meanings, discovering that it had been associated with both memory and mourning since ancient times. In medieval monasteries, monks had used rosemary in funeral rites, believing it helped guide souls safely to their eternal rest. The killer's use of this particular plant suggested education, perhaps even religious training. The fog began to shift and swirl with increased intensity, and Caldwell realised that the wind had changed direction. The mist now moved from the southeast, flowing around the church like water around a stone pier. This was the same wind pattern that had been present during each of the previous murders, a meteorological coincidence that seemed too precise to be mere chance. As midnight approached, the inspector rose from the bench and began to make his way back toward the church proper. The building's Norman architecture emerged gradually from the fog, its rounded arches and thick walls speaking of an age when London had been a very different place. The wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing a thin line of golden light from within. Father Whitmore often kept vigil during the deepest hours of night, praying for his parishioners and maintaining the eternal flame that had burned before the altar for over 3 centuries. Caldwell approached the church entrance with growing unease, though he could not have articulated the source of his discomfort. Perhaps it was the way the fog seemed to press against the ancient stones, or how the light from within cast strange shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. The inspector placed his hand upon the heavy oak door, feeling the wood's texture beneath his palm, worn smooth by countless hands across the centuries. The interior of the church welcomed him with warmth and the familiar scent of beeswax candles and old stone. Father Whitmore knelt before the altar, his white head bowed in prayer, seemingly oblivious to the inspector's entrance. Caldwell waited respectfully in the shadows, observing the priest's devotions while his eyes adjusted to the dim illumination provided by perhaps 24 candles arranged throughout the nave. The church's interior revealed the accumulated patina of 8 centuries of worship. Dark wooden pews bore the marks of countless congregations, their surfaces polished by the touch of generations of hands. Stained glass windows, their colours muted in the candlelight, depicted scenes from the lives of saints whose names had been forgotten by all but the most learned theologians. Above the altar, a carved crucifix gazed down with eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and infinite compassion. Father Whitmore concluded his prayers and rose slowly, his aged joints protesting the movement. He turned toward Caldwell with a gentle smile, showing no surprise at finding a visitor in his church at such an hour. The priest's face bore the lines of 7 decades of life, but his eyes remained clear and kind, reflecting the candlelight like pools of still water. The two men spoke quietly in the hushed atmosphere of the church, their voices barely rising above whispers out of respect for the sacred space. Father Whitmore confirmed that he had indeed noticed the increased police presence in the neighbourhood, though he expressed more concern for his parishioners' spiritual welfare than for their physical safety. Evil, he observed, had always walked the streets of London, but faith provided protection more reliable than any earthly authority. As their conversation continued, Caldwell found himself studying the priest with growing interest. Father Whitmore possessed extensive knowledge of the neighbourhood's history, speaking familiarly of families who had lived in the same tenements for generations. More significantly, his duties required him to move freely through the streets at all hours, bringing comfort to the dying and blessing to the newborn. The inspector began to wonder what the priest might have observed during his nocturnal ministrations. The fog outside had grown so dense that it seemed to press against the church windows like living darkness. Caldwell could no longer see the street lamps that had guided his earlier navigation, and the familiar sounds of the city had been muffled into silence. Within this cocoon of mist, the church felt like a sanctuary existing outside of time itself, connected to the present world only by the thin threads of candlelight that flickered against the ancient stones. Father Whitmore spoke of his concern for the neighbourhood's moral climate, expressing particular worry about the influence of certain medical students who frequented the local taverns. These young men, he explained, often spoke with disturbing fascination about the processes of death and decay, approaching such subjects with what the priest considered unseemly enthusiasm. The inspector listened with growing attention, recognizing the potential significance of this observation. As the church bell tolled midnight, Caldwell realized that the fog had reached the precise density that characterized each of the previous murder nights. The killer's hunting hour had arrived, and somewhere in the grey labyrinth beyond the church walls, a predator might already be moving toward an appointed destination. The inspector rose from the pew where he had been sitting, his decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. The pattern was complete now, visible at last like a picture emerging from morning mist. The killer used the church as navigation point, the fog as camouflage, and possessed knowledge that could only come from medical training or anatomical study. Most importantly, the murders occurred with meteorological precision that suggested intimate familiarity with London's weather patterns, the kind of knowledge possessed by someone who spent considerable time observing the city's atmospheric moods. Caldwell bid farewell to Father Whitmore and stepped once more into the fog-shrouded night, carrying with him new understanding and growing determination. The killer had created a pattern, and patterns could be predicted, anticipated, perhaps even interrupted. Tomorrow night would bring another heavy fog, according to the barometric readings the inspector had been tracking, and with it, quite possibly, another opportunity for justice to finally emerge from the grey veil that had concealed so much darkness. Chapter 4. The Pattern in the Mist. The gaslight flickered against the November fog like dying stars, casting wavering shadows across the cobblestones of Dorset Street, as Inspector Caldwell made his way through the labyrinthine passages of Whitechapel. The year 1873 had brought London the heaviest mists in living memory, and within those grey veils, death moved with calculated precision. Each morning brought fresh horror. Each investigation led deeper into confusion, and each night the fog returned thicker than before. Caldwell had spent countless hours poring over the evidence scattered across his oak desk at Scotland Yard, searching for connections that might illuminate the darkness. 7 victims now lay in their graves, 7 families mourned their dead, and 7 crime scenes yielded nothing but questions wrapped in grey shrouds of uncertainty. The newspapers had christened the perpetrator the Fog Killer, a name that rolled off tongues with delicious terror in drawing rooms across London, while the poor of Whitechapel huddled behind locked doors after sunset. The inspector's leather boots echoed against wet stone as he traced the familiar route through Commercial Street, past the shuttered shops and darkened windows of tenements that rose like tombstones into the murky air. His breath formed pale clouds that dissolved instantly into the surrounding gloom, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the quarter hour with notes that seemed to hang suspended in the thick atmosphere before fading into silence. 3 months had passed since the first killing, and Caldwell found himself walking the same streets night after night, searching for patterns that seemed to shift like the fog itself whenever he thought he might grasp them. The victims appeared random at first glance, connected only by their presence in these narrow passages when the mist descended heaviest. Mary Fletcher, a seamstress returning from late work; Thomas Whitmore, a dock labourer seeking shelter from the cold; Sarah Pemberton, a flower seller who had lingered too long at her corner post. Yet as Caldwell studied the details more closely, subtle connections began to emerge from the chaos-like shapes materializing in the fog. Each victim had been found during the thickest mists of the month, when visibility dropped to mere feet and the gaslights became useless beacons swallowed by grey darkness. Each had been discovered in locations that formed a peculiar geometry across the district, as if the killer moved according to some internal map that existed only in his mind. The inspector paused beneath a lamppost where Thrall Street intersected with Flower and Dean, consulting the small leather notebook he carried in his waistcoat pocket. By the weak yellow light he examined the careful sketches he had made of each crime scene, the precise measurements he had recorded, the times and weather conditions noted in his methodical handwriting. A pattern began to emerge, subtle as morning frost on glass but unmistakable once perceived. The killer struck only when the fog reached a particular density, when the air itself became a living wall that muffled sound and concealed movement. He chose victims who were alone and vulnerable, but more than that, he selected individuals who would be missed slowly, whose absence might not be noticed until hours had passed and the fog had lifted to reveal their still forms arranged with disturbing care. Caldwell's investigation had revealed that each victim possessed a small personal item that had been deliberately repositioned near their body. Mary Fletcher's thimble, normally kept in her sewing basket, had been placed precisely beside her left hand. Thomas Whitmore's clay pipe, usually tucked in his shirt pocket, lay exactly parallel to his right shoulder. These details had been omitted from the newspaper accounts, known only to the inspector and the constables who had first discovered the bodies. The fog seemed to thicken as Caldwell continued his patrol, wrapping around the buildings like ghostly fingers and reducing the world to a sphere of grey visibility that extended barely beyond arm's length. The gaslights became mere suggestions of warmth in the cold air, their flames dancing behind curtains of mist that shifted and swirled with each breath of wind from the Thames. As he walked, the inspector considered the possibility that the killer possessed intimate knowledge of the district's layout, moving through the maze of streets and alleys with confidence that spoke of long familiarity. The fog might conceal his movements from potential witnesses, but it would also blind him unless he knew every stone and corner by memory. This suggested someone who belonged to Whitechapel, who had walked these passages for years until they became as familiar as the rooms of his own dwelling. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere ahead, muffled and distorted by the thick air until their direction became impossible to determine. Caldwell paused, pressing himself against the damp brick wall of a tenement building, listening intently to the rhythm of leather against cobblestone. The steps seemed to circle around him, now approaching from the left, now fading toward the right, as if the walker moved according to some predetermined route that intersected with his own path. In the distance, a clock tower chimed the half-hour, its bronze notes hanging in the air like suspended judgment, before dissolving into the grey silence that enveloped the district. The fog had reached that peculiar density that seemed to absorb all sound, while simultaneously amplifying the smallest whispers, creating an atmosphere where imagination and reality blurred like ink in water. Caldwell's study of the crime scenes had revealed another disturbing pattern that he had shared with no one, not even his superior at Scotland Yard. Each victim had been discovered with their clothing arranged in a manner that suggested careful consideration, rather than hasty violence. Coats were folded neatly beside bodies, shoes placed in precise parallel lines, personal effects organised with an attention to detail that spoke of methodical thinking, rather than passionate crime. The killer worked slowly and deliberately, taking time to arrange his gruesome tableau even while the fog provided temporary concealment. This suggested someone comfortable with the environment, someone who felt safe enough in these streets to linger over his work without fear of discovery. The possibility that he might be watching from nearby windows during the subsequent investigations had occurred to Caldwell more than once. Observing the confusion of the constables and the futile searches for clues. Moving deeper into the heart of Whitechapel, Caldwell found himself in Dorset Street, where the fog seemed to pool in the narrow passage like grey water in a stone channel. The buildings rose on either side like cliff faces, their upper stories lost in the murky darkness above, their ground floor windows shuttered tight against the November cold. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the distant drip of condensation from overhead gutters and the whisper of his own breathing. The inspector had interviewed dozens of residents in the weeks following each killing, searching for witnesses who might have seen or heard something unusual during the fog-shrouded nights. Most claimed to have noticed nothing, keeping to their rooms when the mist descended and the streets became treacherous passages where familiar landmarks vanished into grey obscurity. A few reported hearing footsteps at odd hours, voices speaking in low tones that might have been conversation, or might have been the wind playing tricks with sound. One witness, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrow, who kept a boarding house on Thrall Street, had described seeing a figure moving through the fog outside her window on the night Mary Fletcher died. The shape had seemed unusually tall, she claimed, and moved with a peculiar gait that reminded her of someone carrying a burden or walking with deliberate care. When pressed for more details, she admitted that the fog had made observation difficult, that shapes and shadows took on qualities that might exist only in the mind of the beholder. As Caldwell continued his patrol, he found himself considering the psychological profile of someone who would choose fog as an ally in murder. The mist transformed London into a different city entirely, creating a landscape where the familiar became foreign and the safe became dangerous. Someone who thrived in such conditions would need to possess an unusual relationship with darkness and concealment, finding comfort in environments that terrified ordinary citizens. The fog began to shift and swirl with a breath of wind from the river, creating momentary gaps in the grey wall that revealed glimpses of familiar doorways and shop fronts before closing again like water flowing back into a temporary channel. These brief clearings allowed Caldwell to verify his location, confirming that his instinctive navigation through the maze of streets remained accurate despite the visual confusion that surrounded him. The killer's choice of victims suggested someone who observed the district carefully, learning the patterns of movement that governed daily life in Whitechapel. He knew which workers returned home late, which residents ventured out during evening hours, which streets offered the best concealment for his activities. This knowledge could only come from patient surveillance, from hours spent watching and waiting for the perfect convergence of fog and opportunity. Standing in the heart of the killing ground, surrounded by the grey silence that had witnessed 7 deaths, Caldwell felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Somewhere in this maze of streets and alleys, a predator moved with confidence born of success, planning his next strike while the inspector struggled to understand patterns that seemed to shift like smoke whenever he thought he might grasp their meaning. The fog continued its eternal dance around the buildings, now thick enough to muffle the sound of his own footsteps, now thin enough to reveal the yellow glow of distant gaslights, like beacons marking safe harbour in a treacherous sea. In this grey world between visibility and blindness, between safety and danger, the hunt continued with patience that would be rewarded by time and the inevitable return of London's concealing mists. Chapter 5. The Pattern in the Mist. The gaslight flickered weakly against the November fog as Inspector Caldwell made his way through the narrow passages of Whitechapel, his footsteps echoing hollow against the wet cobblestones. 3 weeks had passed since the 7th victim had been discovered, and the investigation had reached a peculiar stillness that troubled him more than the frantic activity of the early days. Scotland Yard had assigned additional constables to patrol the district, yet the killer seemed to have vanished as completely as morning mist beneath the sun. Caldwell paused at the corner of Dorset Street, withdrawing his pocket watch to catch the dim glow of a nearby lamp. 10:30 in the evening, and the fog had begun its nightly descent upon the city like a familiar shroud. The inspector had spent countless hours these past months studying the meteorological reports from Greenwich Observatory, correlating the density of London's notorious fogs with the dates of each murder. What he had discovered chilled him more thoroughly than the November air seeping through his woolen overcoat. The killer struck only during the thickest fogs, when visibility dropped below 10 yards and the city became a maze of grey shadows and muffled sounds. More disturbing still, the attacks appeared to follow the tidal patterns of the Thames, occurring precisely when the fog rolled inland from the river during the changing of the tides. This was no random madman stalking through the streets, but someone who understood the rhythms of London's weather as intimately as a ship's captain knew the moods of the sea. Inside his leather satchel, Caldwell carried detailed maps of each crime scene, annotated with his careful observations. The victims had been taken from a precise geographic pattern that formed an irregular spiral beginning near the London docks and moving steadily inland towards Spitalfields. If his calculations proved correct, the next attack would occur somewhere along Commercial Street, where the fog gathered thickest as it flowed between the tall warehouses and tenement buildings. The inspector's breath formed pale clouds in the frigid air as he continued his solitary patrol. His superiors at Scotland Yard had grown increasingly sceptical of his theories, preferring to focus their efforts on questioning known criminals and searching for conventional motives. Commissioner Warren himself had suggested that Caldwell was allowing the peculiarities of London's weather to cloud his judgment, but the inspector remained convinced that understanding the fog held the key to capturing their quarry. As he walked, Caldwell reflected upon the 7 victims whose lives had been claimed by this mysterious predator. Martha Henley, a seamstress returning from her evening employment at a textile factory. James Morrison, a dock worker making his way home through the narrow lanes. Sarah Whitmore, who sold flowers at Spitalfields Market and knew every shortcut through the district. Each had vanished during the thickest fog, their bodies discovered hours later in locations that seemed impossible for a random killer to find in such conditions. The fog began to thicken as Caldwell approached Commercial Street, transforming the familiar neighbourhood into an alien landscape of shifting shadows and indistinct shapes. Gaslights became pale halos floating in the grey void, while the sounds of the city grew muffled and distorted. The inspector pressed himself against the cold brick wall of a warehouse, listening intently to the subtle sounds that emerged from the mist. Footsteps approached from somewhere ahead, measured and deliberate rather than hurried. Caldwell held his breath, straining to determine the direction and distance of the sound. The fog played tricks with acoustics, making voices seem to whisper from empty air, while footsteps echoed from multiple directions simultaneously. He gripped the handle of his truncheon, feeling the familiar weight of the polished wood beneath his fingers. The footsteps ceased abruptly, leaving only the distant murmur of the city and the soft drip of condensation from overhead pipes and awnings. Caldwell waited, counting his heartbeats while the fog swirled around him like a living thing. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll the hour, its bronze voice cutting through the mist with solemn authority. 11 chimes marked the passage of time, each note hanging in the air before dissolving into silence. Moving cautiously forward, the inspector navigated by memory and the faint glow of gaslights that appeared and disappeared like beacons in the grey void. His detailed study of the area during daylight hours served him well now, as he could visualize the placement of doorways, alleyways, and obstacles even when they remained invisible in the fog. This intimate knowledge of the terrain convinced him further that the killer possessed similar familiarity with Whitechapel's labyrinthine streets. The fog seemed to pulse and breathe around him, growing thicker and thinner in irregular waves that followed no pattern he could discern. Caldwell had read extensively about London's meteorological phenomena, learning that the city's unique geography created conditions unlike anywhere else in the world. The Thames wound through the heart of the metropolis like a great serpent, carrying moisture and industrial smoke that mingled with the natural vapours rising from the river. When atmospheric conditions aligned precisely, this combination created fog so dense they transformed the familiar city into an alien realm. As he continued his patrol, Caldwell encountered other figures moving through the mist. A night soil man pushing his cart through the narrow lanes, navigating by instinct and long practice. A constable walking his beat, his bullseye lantern creating a small circle of visibility in the grey void. A woman hurrying home from some late employment, her shawl pulled tight against the chill air. Each encounter reminded the inspector how vulnerable ordinary citizens became during these thick fogs, when predators could move unseen mere yards from their victims. The inspector paused at the entrance to a narrow alley, studying the way the fog flowed between the tall buildings like water through a channel. His observations had taught him that the killer possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate during the densest conditions, suggesting either extensive practice or knowledge that went beyond what any ordinary criminal might possess. Perhaps this individual worked on the Thames, learning to read the subtle currents and patterns of London's maritime weather. Or perhaps they had military experience, trained in reconnaissance and movement through difficult terrain. A soft sound echoed from somewhere ahead, barely audible above the ambient noise of the sleeping city. Caldwell strained his ears, trying to identify whether he had heard footsteps, a closing door, or merely the settling of old buildings in the damp air. The fog muffled sounds so completely that determining distance and direction became nearly impossible, creating an acoustic landscape as confusing as the visual maze surrounding him. The inspector withdrew his notebook, feeling for the pencil tucked between its pages. Even in the poor light, he wanted to record his observations about how the fog moved through this particular area. The way it gathered in certain doorways while avoiding others might provide clues about air currents and wind patterns that could help predict where the killer might strike next. Every detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant, could prove vital in understanding their quarry's methods. As midnight approached, Caldwell found himself thinking about the families of the 7 victims, each waiting for news that would never bring comfort. The fog that served as the killer's accomplice had become a source of terror for everyone living in these narrow streets. When the grey mist began to roll in from the Thames, mothers called their children inside and workers hurried home through the shortest routes possible. The very weather that had always been a characteristic feature of London life had transformed into something sinister and threatening. The inspector's methodical patrol continued through the maze of streets and alleyways, his senses alert to every sound and movement in the grey void around him. He had developed an almost intuitive sense for the fog's behaviour, learning to read its density and movement like a shepherd reading clouds. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with a tension that made his skin prickle beneath his heavy overcoat. The fog seemed thicker than usual, more persistent, as if it had been summoned by some unnatural force. A distant scream pierced the mist, sharp and brief before being swallowed by the grey silence. Caldwell froze, trying to determine the direction of the sound while his heart hammered against his ribs. The scream had carried the unmistakable note of mortal terror, cutting through the fog's acoustic dampening with desperate intensity. He began moving toward where he believed the sound had originated, knowing that every second of delay might mean another life lost to their elusive predator. The fog seemed to close around him like a living thing, growing denser with each step as he navigated by instinct and memory through the narrow passages. His breathing grew laboured, not from exertion, but from the thick moisture that filled his lungs with each inhalation. The gaslight ahead flickered weakly, barely penetrating the grey curtain that had descended upon the city like a suffocating blanket. As Inspector Caldwell pressed deeper into the heart of Whitechapel's fog-shrouded streets, he realised that tonight would bring either breakthrough or tragedy. The pattern he had so carefully mapped was about to reveal its next chapter, and somewhere in the grey void ahead, the fog killer moved with deadly purpose through the maze of London's darkest district. Chapter 6. The Pattern in the Mist. The November fog that shrouded London in 1873 possessed qualities that seemed almost supernatural to those who lived beneath its oppressive weight. Unlike the ordinary mist that rose from the Thames each autumn, this particular phenomenon had settled over the metropolis with the persistence of something alive, something intelligent. It clung to the city's bones with tendrils that reached into every alleyway, every doorway, every shadow where a soul might seek refuge from the growing terror that stalked the streets. Inspector Thomas Caldwell had spent the better part of 3 decades walking these same cobblestones, first as a constable in the rough districts south of the river, then as a detective sergeant working the docks where bodies appeared with the regularity of the tide. He had seen knife work that would turn a strong man's stomach, discovered corpses in states of decay that defied description, and stood over victims whose final moments had been written in blood across tenement walls. Yet nothing in his considerable experience had prepared him for the methodical precision of the killer who'd claimed 7 lives since August. The pattern had emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in the chemical baths of the new studios that dotted the city. At first, the deaths appeared random: a dock worker found floating near London Bridge, a seamstress discovered in her lodging room near Aldgate, an elderly rag picker whose body lay crumpled in a doorway off Commercial Street. The Metropolitan Police had treated each case as isolated incidents, the unfortunate but predictable result of life in London's most desperate quarters. But Caldwell possessed the methodical mind of a natural philosopher, trained through years of observation to detect connections where others saw only chaos. He had begun mapping the locations of the murders on a large sheet of paper in his modest rooms above a bakery in Bermondsey, marking each site with a small red cross. The pattern that emerged resembled nothing so much as a spider's web, with each killing positioned at carefully calculated intervals around the heart of Whitechapel. More disturbing still was the temporal precision of the attacks. The killer struck only during the heaviest fog, when visibility dropped to mere yards, and the usual flow of pedestrian traffic slowed to isolated figures hurrying through the murk like ghosts. The murders occurred at intervals of exactly 12 days, always between the hours of 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning, always when the mist rolled thickest through the narrow streets. The victim shared certain characteristics that had taken weeks to identify. All were solitary figures with few social connections, people whose absence might not be noticed for days. All lived or worked within a precisely defined geographical area bounded by Commercial Street to the west, Whitechapel Road to the south, Cambridge Heath Road to the east, and Bethnal Green Road to the north. All had been killed with a blade that left distinctive markings, shallow cuts that suggested a weapon of unusual design. Most unsettling of all, each victim had been found with a small piece of parchment tucked into their clothing, bearing the same cryptic message written in a careful hand. "The fog remembers what the light forgets." The Scotland Yard investigators had dismissed these notes as the ravings of a madman, but Caldwell suspected they contained a deeper significance that eluded conventional understanding. The evening of November 20th found the inspector standing beneath a flickering gaslight at the corner of Dorset Street, watching the fog swirl around the lamppost like water around a stone. He had spent the afternoon reviewing the case files one more time, studying the statements of witnesses, examining the coroner's reports, searching for any detail that might illuminate the darkness surrounding these crimes. The fog pressed against his face with cold fingers, carrying the familiar sense of coal smoke, sewage, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that seemed to follow the mist wherever it drifted. Around him, the sounds of the city grew muffled and distant. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone became a whisper. The voices of late evening revellers faded to murmurs. Even his own footsteps seemed absorbed by the grey blanket that surrounded him. Caldwell had come to understand that the killer possessed an intimate knowledge of London's weather patterns, an ability to predict when the fog would descend with sufficient density to provide cover for the dark work ahead. This suggested someone with access to meteorological information, perhaps a clerk at the newly established weather station, or a ship's captain familiar with reading atmospheric conditions. The precision of the timing argued against mere opportunism and pointed toward careful planning. The inspector had also begun to suspect that the geographic pattern of the murders held significance beyond mere convenience. The locations formed a rough circle around Christchurch Spitalfields, the magnificent Hawksmoor edifice that dominated the skyline of the area with its towering spire. Each murder site lay at approximately the same distance from the church, as if the killer were following some ancient ritual that required specific spatial relationships. Local residents spoke in hushed tones of strange sounds that preceded the attacks. Not the screams or struggles one might expect, but rather a peculiar humming or chanting that seemed to emerge from the fog itself. Several witnesses claimed to have heard what sounded like religious incantations, though none could identify the language or recall the specific words. These accounts might have been dismissed as the product of fear and superstition, but they came from too many independent sources to ignore entirely. The fog killer's victims had been discovered in poses that suggested ritualistic positioning, rather than the random violence typical of street crimes. Bodies were invariably found lying with arms crossed over the chest, heads oriented toward the east, faces bearing expressions of what several observers described as peaceful resignation rather than terror. The wounds themselves were inflicted with surgical precision, suggesting medical knowledge or at least considerable anatomical understanding. Caldwell had spent countless hours walking the streets of Whitechapel in recent weeks, familiarizing himself with every alley and court, every tenement and warehouse, every public house and lodging room. He had spoken with costermongers and crossing sweepers, with seamstresses and flower sellers, with anyone who might have observed something unusual during the fog-bound nights when death stalked the district. Gradually, a disturbing picture had emerged of a killer who moved through the mist with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the terrain. Witnesses described a figure of medium height and build, always dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend with the fog itself. The killer appeared to possess an uncanny ability to approach victims without detection, striking swiftly and silently before vanishing back into the grey veil. The absence of any signs of struggle at the crime scenes particularly troubled the inspector. The victims appeared to have offered no resistance, as if they had willingly submitted to their fate. This suggested either that the killer possessed some means of rendering victims unconscious before inflicting the fatal wounds, or that the victims knew their attacker and felt no immediate threat. On this particular evening, Caldwell had positioned himself at what his calculation suggested would be the location of the 8th murder. The pattern demanded a killing tonight, and the fog provided perfect conditions. If his analysis proved correct, the killer would strike somewhere within a 2-block radius of his current position, between the hours of 10 and midnight. The church bells of Christchurch had just finished tolling 11, when the inspector noticed a subtle change in the quality of the fog around him. The grey mass seemed to shift and thicken, creating pockets of deeper shadow that had not been present moments before. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the organic smell that had haunted his nostrils all evening grew stronger and more distinct. Caldwell pressed himself deeper into the doorway of a shuttered bakery, straining to peer through the murk that surrounded him. The fog seemed to move with purpose now, flowing along the streets like a river of vapour seeking its inevitable destination. Within that flowing grey mass, the inspector caught glimpses of movement, shapes that appeared human but seemed to glide rather than walk across the uneven cobblestones. The silence that descended over the district felt oppressive and complete, as if the fog had absorbed not only light and sound but the very breath of the city itself. No footsteps echoed from the surrounding streets, no voices carried on the night air. Even the ever-present sound of dripping water from the eaves above seemed muffled to the point of extinction. Then, cutting through the supernatural quiet, came the sound that several witnesses had described, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the fog itself rather than from any particular direction. The melody was haunting and strangely beautiful, with qualities that suggested great antiquity, as if it belonged to some forgotten tradition that predated Christianity's arrival in Britain. Caldwell felt his pulse quicken as the humming grew louder and more distinct. The sound appeared to be moving toward him, accompanied by the soft whisper of fabric against stone that had become the killer's signature. The inspector reached instinctively for the truncheon at his belt while fighting the urge to flee from whatever approached through the concealing mist. The fog swirled more violently now, creating eddies and currents that revealed brief glimpses of the street beyond before closing again like curtains drawn across a window. In one of those momentary clearings, Caldwell saw a figure standing perhaps 20 yards away, motionless as a statue, seeming to stare directly at him through the grey veil. The figure wore a long coat that reached nearly to the ground, and a hat with a wide brim that cast deep shadows across features the inspector could not distinguish. In one hand, something caught the faint gleam of the distant gaslight, something that might have been the ritual blade that had claimed 7 lives. For a long moment, neither man moved. The humming continued, growing more complex and haunting, weaving patterns of sound that seemed to resonate in the bones and blood of anyone who heard them. The fog pressed closer, reducing visibility to mere yards, and when it finally thinned enough to see clearly again, the figure had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Caldwell remained frozen in his doorway for several more minutes, listening for any sound that might indicate the killer's location. But the district had returned to its unnatural silence, and the fog began to thin slightly as midnight approached. Whatever dark business had brought the mysterious figure to these streets would have to wait for another night, another victim, another opportunity to strike from within the concealing mist. As the inspector finally emerged from his hiding place and began the long walk back to his lodgings, he carried with him the disturbing certainty that the fog killer was aware of his investigation. The brief encounter had felt less like chance and more like a deliberate message, a warning that some secrets were too dangerous for even Scotland Yard's most determined detective to uncover. The pattern would continue, as precise and predictable as the movements of clockwork, until someone found the key to understanding the ancient ritual that played out in London's fog-shrouded streets. Chapter 7. The Pattern in the Mist. The gaslight flickered against the November fog like dying stars, casting weak halos that barely penetrated the thick veil settling over London's eastern districts. Inspector Caldwell stood beneath the wavering flame of a street lamp on Dorset Street, his breath visible in small puffs that merged seamlessly with the surrounding mist. The weight of his investigation pressed upon his shoulders like the damp wool of his greatcoat, heavy with accumulated moisture and the burden of 7 unsolved deaths. 3 months had passed since the first victim was discovered in the narrow confines of Thrall Street, her body arranged with a peculiar precision that spoke of deliberate intention rather than random violence. The fog had been particularly dense that August evening, rolling in from the Thames with unusual persistence, blanketing the maze of courts and alleys that comprised the heart of Whitechapel. Each subsequent death had occurred during periods of exceptional atmospheric thickness, when the city's notorious yellow mist transformed familiar streets into alien landscapes where sound travelled strangely and shadows held secrets. Caldwell withdrew his pocket watch, tilting its face toward the struggling gaslight. The Roman numerals showed 11:30, and he knew from careful study of the established pattern that the killer's activities typically commenced near the stroke of midnight. The inspector had spent countless hours poring over the case files in his modest lodgings near Commercial Road, mapping not only the locations of each crime but the meteorological conditions that preceded them. The correlation was undeniable, though his superiors at Scotland Yard remained sceptical of what they termed his atmospheric theories. The fog pressed closer around him, reducing visibility to mere yards and muffling the sounds of the sleeping city. Somewhere in the distance, a cat yowled with primal urgency before falling silent. The inspector's leather boots made soft clicking sounds against the wet cobblestones as he began his careful patrol of the predetermined route. He had calculated the killer's movements with mathematical precision, noting the distances between crime scenes, the timing of each incident, and the meteorological reports from the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Mrs. Weatherby had been the first victim, a seamstress who worked late hours in her cramped room above a bakery. The landlord had found her the following morning, positioned with unnatural care near her workbench, her sewing implements arranged in a perfect semicircle around her still form. The fog that night had been so thick that the lamplighters had abandoned their rounds early, leaving entire streets in darkness. Inspector Morrison, who had initially handled the case, attributed the death to natural causes complicated by the poor air quality that plagued London's industrial districts. The second victim, a crossing sweeper named Thomas Hartwell, was discovered 3 weeks later during another period of exceptional fog density. The man had been found seated upright on his usual corner near the Ten Bells public house, his broom positioned across his lap with ceremonial precision. The coroner's examination revealed no obvious signs of violence, though the body showed symptoms consistent with respiratory distress. Again, Inspector Morrison concluded that the thick air had simply overwhelmed a constitution already weakened by years of poverty and exposure. It was only after the third death that patterns began to emerge which could not be dismissed as coincidence. Miss Adelaide Fenwick, a flower seller who worked the entrance to Spitalfields Market, was found arranged with the same careful attention to detail. Her basket of wilted chrysanthemums had been placed beside her, with geometric precision, each stem pointing in the same direction. The fog that night had been so dense that omnibus service ceased after 9 o'clock, and several pedestrians had become lost within sight of their own doorsteps. Caldwell had assumed responsibility for the investigation following Inspector Morrison's sudden retirement, a decision that coincided suspiciously with his superior's growing nervousness about the case. The younger inspector brought fresh eyes and methodical approach to the growing mystery. Where Morrison had seen unrelated incidents exacerbated by poor weather conditions, Caldwell recognised deliberate staging and careful timing. Each victim had been discovered in a position that suggested peaceful death rather than struggle, yet the circumstances surrounding their demise remained inexplicable. The fourth and fifth victims, an elderly rag picker named Solomon Morse and a night soil collector called William Darby, were found during the same extraordinary fog bank that persisted for 4 consecutive nights in October. Both men were discovered seated against brick walls in different alleyways, their faces bearing expressions of strange tranquility. The positioning of their bodies suggested they had simply sat down to rest and never risen again. Local residents reported that the fog during those October nights had been unlike anything in living memory, so thick that people became disoriented within yards of their own homes. Mrs. Catherine Mills, the sixth victim, had been a charwoman who cleaned offices in the commercial district near Aldgate. Her body was found in the early hours of October morning, seated peacefully on the steps of St. Botolph's Church. her cleaning supplies arranged in neat rows beside her. The vicar who discovered her described the fog as having an unusual quality, almost luminescent in the pre-dawn darkness, with a strange, sweet scent that reminded him of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The most recent victim, discovered just a week prior to Caldwell's current nocturnal patrol, had been a lamplighter named Frederick Ashworth. The irony of his profession was not lost on the inspector, as the man responsible for bringing light to dark streets had been found extinguished beneath his own lamppost. His lighter and oil can were positioned with the same meticulous care that characterized all the previous crime scenes, and witnesses reported that the fog that night had seemed to move with unnatural purpose, flowing through the streets like a living creature. Caldwell paused at the corner of Fashion Street, consulting his carefully annotated map by the weak light of a struggling gas flame. His calculation suggested that if the pattern held true, the next incident would occur somewhere within a triangle formed by the previous 3 crime scenes. The inspector had marked this area with red ink, noting the proximity to several distinctive landmarks, including Christ Church Spitalfields and the market buildings that formed the commercial heart of the district. The fog seemed to thicken as he ventured deeper into the predetermined zone, rolling through the narrow passages between buildings with almost liquid persistence. The inspector's trained eye noted details that others might miss, the way the mist clung to certain surfaces while avoiding others, the subtle variations in density that created pockets of relative clarity, surrounded by walls of impenetrable vapour. There was something almost purposeful about its movement, as though guided by intelligence rather than merely following the natural patterns of wind and temperature. A church bell began to toll the midnight hour, its bronze voice carrying strangely through the thick air. Caldwell counted each stroke, feeling his pulse quicken as the final note faded into the surrounding silence. According to his careful analysis, the killer's activities typically commenced within minutes of midnight, using the fog's densest moments to approach victims undetected. The inspector positioned himself at the intersection of 2 narrow courts, hoping to observe any unusual movement or activity. The silence that followed the bell's final chime was profound, broken only by the distant drip of condensation from overhead gutters and the soft scratch of his own breathing. Caldwell strained his ears for any sound that might indicate human presence in the surrounding maze of alleyways and passages. The fog had reached such density that he could barely make out the outline of buildings just yards away, transforming the familiar geography of Whitechapel into an alien landscape of suggestion and shadow. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness as the inspector maintained his vigil. The cold began to penetrate his heavy woolen clothing, and moisture from the fog condensed on his moustache and the brim of his bowler hat. He found himself thinking about the victims, wondering what they had experienced in their final moments, whether they had been aware of approaching danger, or had simply succumbed to whatever mysterious force stalked London's fog-shrouded streets. A sound reached his ears through the thick air, so faint that he initially questioned whether he had imagined it. The soft whisper of fabric against stone, followed by the barely audible scrape of leather against wet cobblestone. Caldwell pressed himself against the nearest wall, feeling the cold dampness of brick through his coat as he attempted to locate the source of the disturbance. His hand moved instinctively to the truncheon at his belt, though he wondered what good conventional weapons might prove against an adversary who seemed to command the very elements. The footsteps, if indeed they were footsteps, seemed to circle his position with predatory patience. The inspector found himself thinking of stories his grandmother had told him as a child, tales of creatures that moved through mist and shadow, beings that existed between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Such superstitions had no place in a modern investigation, yet the circumstances of the case seemed to challenge conventional understanding of crime and criminality. The fog swirled with sudden intensity, creating momentary clearings that revealed glimpses of empty doorways and shuttered windows before closing again like curtains drawn by invisible hands. In one of these brief revelations, Caldwell thought he glimpsed a figure moving with fluid grace between the shadows. But when the mist parted again, the space was empty. The inspector began to question whether isolation and concentration had begun to affect his perception, creating phantoms where none existed. A new sound reached him through the dense air, the soft chiming of a clock somewhere in the distance marking the quarter hour after midnight. The inspector realized that he had been standing motionless for nearly 15 minutes, yet his sense of time had become distorted by the fog's disorienting effects. The white vapour seemed to muffle not only sound but temporal awareness itself, creating a suspension of normal experience that left him feeling adrift in an eternal present. As the fog began to shift and swirl around him with increasing intensity, Caldwell found himself moving forward almost involuntarily, drawn deeper into the labyrinth of narrow streets and courts that formed the heart of his patrol area. Each step seemed to lead him further from familiar landmarks, though he could not be certain whether this was due to disorientation or deliberate misdirection. The gaslight grew dimmer behind him, its weak glow eventually disappearing entirely as he advanced into the fog's embrace. The inspector's breathing had become more laboured, whether from exertion or the thick quality of the air itself. He paused to consult his pocket compass, but the needle seemed to waver uncertainly, unable to find true north in the dense atmospheric conditions. For the first time since beginning his solitary investigation, Caldwell began to wonder whether his methodical approach might have led him into danger rather than towards solution. The fog continued to thicken around him, and somewhere in its depths the soft sound of approaching footsteps grew steadily closer, promising answers to questions that perhaps were better left unasked. Chapter 8. The pattern emerges. The gaslight flickered against the window panes of the Metropolitan Police Headquarters at Great Scotland Yard, casting dancing shadows across Inspector Caldwell's desk, where maps of Whitechapel lay spread like ancient parchments. November's bitter wind rattled the glass, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and the Thames' perpetual dampness. The fog that had blanketed London for weeks showed no signs of lifting, and within its grey embrace the city seemed to hold its breath. Caldwell traced his finger along the narrow streets marked in red ink, each notation representing another victim of the mysterious killer who had terrorised the East End for 3 months. The pattern that had eluded his colleagues at Scotland Yard was becoming clearer with each passing night, though the revelation brought him no comfort. 7 deaths, each occurring during the thickest fog, each victim found in locations that formed a peculiar geometric arrangement across the borough. The first victim, Margaret Thornfield, had been discovered in Dorset Street on a September evening when the mist had rolled in from the Thames like a living thing. A seamstress returning from her evening shift at a clothing manufactory, she had been found at dawn by a crossing sweeper, her body arranged with an almost ceremonial precision that had puzzled the examining physician. No signs of robbery, no evidence of the usual violence that plagued the district's darker corners. Then came Thomas Whitmore, a night watchman found 3 days later in Commercial Street, positioned in the same peculiar manner. The fog had been so thick that evening that the gas lamps appeared as mere halos of light floating in an endless grey void. Witnesses spoke of sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Footsteps that echoed strangely in the muffled air, voices that might have been wind or might have been something more sinister. By October, when the 3rd and 4th victims were discovered, the newspapers had begun their sensational coverage. The Morning Chronicle dubbed the perpetrator the Fog Killer, while the Times maintained its characteristic restraint, referring only to the recent unfortunate incidents in the East End. But restraint could not mask the growing unease that permeated London society as autumn deepened, and the fog seemed to thicken with each passing week. Caldwell had walked every street where the bodies were found, spoken with every witness, examined every piece of evidence that Scotland Yard's resources could uncover. What struck him most profoundly was not what he found, but what he failed to find. No murder weapon, no clear motive, No connection between the victims beyond their unfortunate presence on London streets during the thickest fog. The killer seemed to materialise from the mist itself, strike with surgical precision, and vanish without trace. The fifth victim, elderly Mrs. Pemberton, had been found in Thrall Street on a night when the fog was so dense that constables could barely see their own hands before their faces. She had been returning from visiting her sister in Spitalfields, a journey she had made safely for 15 years. Her landlady reported that Mrs. Pemberton carried a small lantern and knew the streets as well as any resident of the district. Yet somehow, in those grey hours before dawn, she had encountered the killer and met the same fate as the others. Dr. Whitfield, the police surgeon who examined each body, had confided to Caldwell his growing bewilderment. The victim showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication that they had even been aware of their attacker's approach. The method of killing was consistent but performed with such skill that it suggested medical knowledge or military training. In his 30 years of examining the victims of London's criminal element, Dr. Whitfield had never encountered anything quite like these murders. The sixth victim had shaken even the most experienced officers at Scotland Yard. Constable Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the force, had been found in Wentworth Street during his regular patrol. His whistle remained unused, his truncheon undrawn. The thick fog that night had reduced visibility to mere inches, but Morrison knew his beat as intimately as a sailor knows his vessel. The discovery of his body sent ripples of fear through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police, for if the killer could strike down one of their own with such ease, no one was safe. Sarah Holt, the seventh victim, had been discovered just 3 days ago in Fashion Street. A flower seller who worked the markets near Petticoat Lane, she had been known for her caution and her habit of travelling with other vendors when the fog grew thick. Yet somehow she had been separated from her companions and found the following morning, positioned with the same inexplicable precision as the others. As Caldwell studied the map, the pattern became undeniable. The locations of the murders, when connected by lines, formed a rough star pattern across Whitechapel, with each point corresponding to an intersection where multiple streets converged. The killer was not choosing victims randomly, but selecting locations with deliberate purpose, creating a design that spanned the entire borough. The fog itself seemed to be more than mere accomplice to these crimes. Caldwell had consulted with meteorologists at the Royal Observatory, learning that the unusual density and persistence of London's autumn fog was indeed extraordinary, even by the city's standards. The combination of industrial smoke, Thames moisture, and atmospheric pressure had created conditions that veteran Londoners claimed they had never witnessed. Some whispered of supernatural causes, while others blamed the new factories sprouting across the city's outskirts. In the coffee houses and public houses of Whitechapel, rumours spread like contagion. Some claimed the killer was a phantom, a vengeful spirit conjured from the Thames-polluted waters. Others suggested a foreign anarchist, using the fog to wage war against British society. The most disturbing theory, whispered in the shadows of gin houses and opium dens, was that the killer possessed an intimate knowledge of the district's geography that could only come from years of residence or official duty. Caldwell's investigation had led him to examine the movements of every resident, visitor and official who might have been present during each murder. The task was monumental, complicated by the transient nature of Whitechapel's population and the reluctance of many residents to cooperate with police inquiries. Yet patterns began to emerge from the chaos of testimony and evidence. 3 individuals appeared in the vicinity of multiple murder sites, their presence documented through witness statements or official records. Dr. Edmund Harrington, a physician who maintained a practice serving the district's poor, had been treating patients near several locations on the nights in question. His medical knowledge would certainly explain the precision of the killings, though his reputation for charitable work seemed to argue against such suspicions. The second suspect was James Hartwell, a former military officer who worked as a night supervisor for the gas company. His duties required him to inspect lighting throughout the East End, providing perfect cover for nocturnal movements. His military background would account for the killer's ability to move silently and strike without warning, and his intimate knowledge of the gaslighting system might explain how the murders occurred in the darkest corners of the district. Most intriguing was the third individual, a figure who appeared in witness statements but whose identity remained frustratingly elusive. Several residents had reported encountering a well-dressed gentleman during the foggy nights, someone who seemed out of place in Whitechapel's working-class streets. Descriptions varied, but witnesses consistently mentioned his unusual calm demeanour and his apparent familiarity with the neighbourhood's maze-like layout. The investigation had consumed Caldwell's every waking hour, transforming him from a methodical officer of the law into something approaching an obsessed hunter. His colleagues noticed the change, the way his eyes had developed a haunted quality, the manner in which he started at unexpected sounds. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of grey figures moving through endless fog, and he found himself walking the streets of Whitechapel at all hours, searching for patterns that remained just beyond his comprehension. Tonight's decision to venture alone into the killer's territory had not been made lightly. Caldwell had noticed that the murders occurred in a predictable sequence, each location building upon the previous to complete the geometric pattern etched across the borough. If his calculations were correct, the next attack would occur in one of 3 remaining locations, each representing a point needed to complete the mysterious design. The fog had grown thicker as evening approached, reducing the familiar streets to abstract shapes and shadows. Gas lamps appeared as ghostly orbs floating in the grey void, while the sounds of normal city life became muffled and distorted. Footsteps echoed strangely in the dense air, seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and the usual landmarks that guided navigation disappeared into the surrounding gloom. As Caldwell made his way through the narrow passages between tenements, he reflected on the psychological profile he had developed of the killer. This was not the work of a common criminal driven by greed or passion, nor was it the random violence that occasionally erupted in London's poorest districts. The precision, the planning, the almost ritualistic arrangement of the victims suggested a mind operating according to its own inexplicable logic. The killer demonstrated remarkable patience, waiting for the perfect conditions before striking. The ability to remain undetected in a heavily populated area indicated either exceptional skill or intimate knowledge of police patrol patterns. Most disturbing was the apparent lack of fear or urgency in the killer's behaviour, as if the murders were simply tasks to be completed rather than desperate acts of violence. Church bells throughout the district began to toll midnight, their bronze voices carrying through the fog with funeral solemnity. Caldwell paused at the intersection of Dorset and Commercial Streets, one of the 3 locations he had identified as a likely site for the next murder. The fog seemed to swirl around him with deliberate malevolence, and for a moment he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake in venturing out alone. Somewhere in the grey distance a footstep echoed against wet cobblestone, followed by the soft whisper of fabric against brick. Caldwell pressed himself against the wall of a lodging house, his heart beating with such intensity that he feared it might give away his position. The sounds grew closer, deliberate and measured, suggesting someone moving with complete confidence through the maze of streets. The fog began to thin slightly, revealing the outline of a familiar doorway just yards away. It was there, in that shadowy recess, that Margaret Thornfield had been found 3 months ago, arranged with the same inexplicable precision that characterized all of the fog killer's work. As realization dawned, Caldwell understood with growing unease that he might have walked directly into the predator's web, becoming not the hunter, but the hunted in London's grey labyrinth. Chapter 9. The Hunter's Moon. The gaslight flickered against the November darkness as Inspector Caldwell made his way through the warren of streets that formed London's most notorious district. The fog had begun its nightly descent earlier than usual, creeping up from the Thames like spectral fingers reaching into every crevice and alleyway of the ancient city. By 10:30, the mist had grown so thick that even the brightest street lamps appeared as mere halos of amber light. their illumination swallowed within mere feet of their glass housings. Caldwell adjusted his wool overcoat against the creeping damp and checked his pocket watch by the dim glow of a nearby lamp. The brass timepiece, a gift from his late father who had served as a constable before him, showed 23 minutes past 11. He had been walking these streets for nearly 3 hours, following a route that corresponded to what he had begun to suspect was the killer's own pattern of movement through the district. The inspector had spent countless hours in his cramped office at Scotland Yard, spreading out the detailed maps of Whitechapel and marking each location where the fog killer had struck. What had emerged from this methodical plotting was not the random scatter of opportunistic violence that his colleagues had assumed, but rather a careful progression through the neighbourhood's geography, each murder site connected to the next in a logical sequence, as if the killer were following some predetermined course through the maze of streets and alleys. 7 victims had fallen to the killer's hands since August, when the first body was discovered in a narrow courtyard behind the 10 Bells public house. Mary Ashford, a seamstress of 26 years, had been found by her landlord when she failed to appear for work at the textile mill where she operated one of the great mechanical looms. The woman's throat had been cut with surgical precision, but there had been no signs of robbery or assault beyond the fatal wound itself. The second victim, discovered a fortnight later, had been Thomas Wickham, a dock worker returning home from his night shift at the London docks. His body was found in Dorset Street, slumped against a brick wall, as if he had simply sat down to rest and never risen again. Like Mary Ashford, he bore a single precise wound across the throat, delivered by someone skilled with a blade and strong enough to cut deeply through muscle and sinew in one swift motion. As autumn deepened and the fog grew thicker with each passing week, the killer's pace had quickened. September brought 3 more deaths. October added 2 more names to the growing list of victims. All bore the same fatal wound. All were discovered in locations that formed an increasingly clear pattern across the district's geography. Caldwell had noticed something else about the murders that his colleagues had overlooked. Each killing had occurred on nights when the fog was particularly dense, when visibility dropped to mere arm's length, and the usual sounds of the city became muffled and distorted. It was as if the killer waited for these perfect conditions, using London's notorious weather as both concealment and ally. The inspector paused at the corner of Thrall Street and Wentworth Street, consulting the small notebook where he had recorded his observations. According to his calculations, if the pattern held true, the next murder would occur somewhere in the vicinity of Flower and Dean Street, perhaps in one of the many narrow passages that connected the larger thoroughfares. The fog tonight was certainly thick enough to provide the cover the killer seemed to prefer. A church bell tolled the quarter hour, its bronze voice carrying strangely through the mist. Caldwell could not identify which of the district's several churches was marking the time, as the fog distorted sound in peculiar ways, making distant noises seem close at hand while swallowing others entirely. The inspector moved forward again, his leather boots striking the wet cobblestones with measured steps. The streets were largely empty at this hour. Most of the district's working population had long since retreated to their lodgings, whether in the crowded tenements that housed multiple families in rooms barely large enough for one, or in the common lodging houses where a bed could be rented by the night for 4p. The few people Caldwell encountered moved quickly through the fog, faces obscured by scarves and coat collars, intent on reaching their destinations without lingering in the grey uncertainty of the November night. As he turned into Flower and Dean Street, the inspector noticed that the gaslight here was particularly poor. Several of the street lamps had either failed entirely or burned so dimly that they provided little more illumination than candles. The fog seemed to gather more thickly in these darker areas, as if drawn by the absence of light. Caldwell moved more slowly now, his hand resting on the truncheon at his belt. The narrow passage of George Yard opened to his left, and the inspector paused to peer into its depths. The alley stretched away into impenetrable darkness, its far end completely invisible in the fog. Somewhere in that grey void, water dripped steadily from overhanging eaves and gutters, creating a rhythm that seemed almost musical in the strange acoustics of the mist-shrouded night. Caldwell had interviewed dozens of residents in the weeks following each murder, seeking any witness who might have seen or heard something unusual on the nights in question. The fog, however, had proven to be the killer's perfect accomplice. Time and again, witnesses reported hearing footsteps, voices, or other sounds during the crucial hours, but none could say with certainty from which direction these sounds had come, or whether they were connected to the crimes. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, who kept a small shop on Commercial Street, had been particularly helpful in describing the atmospheric conditions that seemed to accompany each murder. She had lived in the district for more than 30 years and claimed to know its weather patterns better than the forecasters at the Royal Observatory. According to her observations, the fog that rolled in from the Thames on murder nights was different from the ordinary mist that frequently blanketed London. The killer's fog, as she had begun to call it, was thicker and more persistent than usual. It seemed to cling to the buildings and streets with unusual tenacity, sometimes lasting well into the following morning, when ordinary fog would have burned off with the sunrise. More significantly, she had noticed that this particular fog had an odd quality to the way it moved, seeming to flow through the streets with an almost purposeful motion, rather than the random drift of normal mist. The inspector had initially dismissed such observations as the fanciful imaginings of a frightened woman, but as the investigation progressed and the pattern became clearer, he had begun to wonder if there might be some truth to her claims. Perhaps the killer possessed some unusual knowledge of weather patterns and chose to strike only when conditions were optimal for concealment and escape. Caldwell's thoughts were interrupted by a sound that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of him in the fog. It was the soft scrape of leather against stone, as if someone wearing shoes or boots was moving carefully along a wall or building face. The inspector stopped immediately, straining to listen for any repetition of the sound. For several seconds there was only the steady drip of condensed fog from the eaves above and the distant hum of the city beyond the immediate blanket of mist. Then he heard it again, closer this time and definitely to his left, in the direction of one of the narrow courts that opened off the main street. Caldwell moved toward the sound, his hand now gripping the handle of his truncheon. His breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the muffled atmosphere, and he found himself consciously trying to move more quietly across the wet cobblestones. The court was one of the many small enclosed spaces that characterised this part of London, surrounded on three sides by the raw walls of tenement buildings. During daylight hours, it served as a gathering place for residents to hang laundry, conduct conversations and allow children to play in whatever open space was available. Now, in the fog-shrouded darkness, it had taken on a more sinister aspect. As Caldwell approached the entrance to the court, he could make out the dim outline of a figure standing near the far wall. The person appeared to be wearing a dark coat or cloak and seemed to be facing away from the inspector, looking toward one of the building entrances. The figure was motionless, as if waiting or watching for something or someone. The inspector's training told him to call out, to identify himself and demand that the person explain their presence in such a location at such an hour. Something about the scene, however, gave him pause. There was a quality of deliberate concealment about the figure's posture and position that suggested this was not merely a resident returning home late, or someone seeking shelter from the fog. Caldwell remained at the mouth of the court, studying the motionless figure and trying to discern more details through the shifting grey veil of mist. The person appeared to be of medium height and build, though the bulky clothing made it difficult to determine much about their physical characteristics. What struck the inspector most forcefully was the complete stillness of the figure, as if they were carved from stone rather than flesh and blood. Minutes passed with neither person moving. The fog continued to swirl around them both, sometimes thickening enough to completely obscure the figure, then thinning just enough to reveal the dark silhouette once again. Caldwell found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his breathing might alert the person to his presence. The church bell tolled midnight, its 12 measured strokes carrying clearly through the mist. As the final chime faded into silence, the figure at the far end of the court began to move. They turned slowly, deliberately, and began walking toward the entrance where Caldwell waited. The inspector pressed himself back against the brick wall, hoping that the fog would conceal him as effectively as it had hidden his quarry. As the figure approached, Caldwell could hear the careful placement of each footstep on the wet cobblestones. There was something methodical about the person's gait, as if they were following a familiar route even in the blinding fog. The inspector's pulse quickened as he realized that this might be his first direct encounter with the person who had terrorized the district for months. The figure passed within arm's reach of where Caldwell stood pressed against the wall. In that moment of closest proximity, the inspector caught a glimpse of pale hands emerging from dark sleeves and the suggestion of a face partially hidden beneath the brim of a hat or cap. Then the person was past him and moving away into the fog, their footsteps growing fainter with each passing second. Caldwell waited until he could no longer hear any sound of movement, then stepped away from the wall and followed in the direction the figure had taken. The fog seemed to close behind the mysterious person, like water filling in the wake of a passing ship, leaving no trace of their passage except the memory of those careful, deliberate footsteps on wet stone. The inspector emerged from the court onto a slightly wider street, but the figure had vanished completely into the grey maze of London's night. Caldwell stood motionless, listening intently for any sound that might indicate which direction his quarry had taken, but the fog had swallowed all trace of the mysterious person as completely as if they had never existed at all. Chapter 10. The Grey Surrender. The fog held London in its ancient embrace that final November night, thick as wool and twice as suffocating. Inspector Caldwell moved through the narrow passages of Whitechapel with the careful steps of a man who had learned to read the language of shadows. 3 months of hunting had taught him that the killer moved like mist itself, flowing through the city's arteries with an almost supernatural awareness of every alley, every doorway, every escape route carved into the labyrinth of Victorian London's darkest quarter. The gaslight on Dorset Street flickered weakly, casting trembling circles of amber that barely penetrated the grey walls surrounding it. Caldwell paused beneath its meagre glow, drawing his coat tighter against the November chill. The leather of his boots had grown soft with constant dampness, and his breath formed pale clouds that vanished instantly into the surrounding darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the Thames moved with its eternal whisper, carrying the scent of coal smoke and human desperation through streets that had witnessed centuries of suffering. He'd spent the evening in the 10 Bells public house, listening to the hushed conversations of dock workers and seamstresses, flower sellers and night soil men. The fog killer had cast a pall over their world that went deeper than mere fear. Women walked in groups now, clutching each other's arms with white-knuckled desperation. Men spoke in lowered voices about things they had seen or thought they had seen moving through the mist. Children were kept indoors after dark, and even the most hardened residents of London's most notorious district crossed themselves when the fog began to gather. The pattern had become clear to Caldwell through weeks of careful observation and painstaking investigation. The killer struck only on nights when the fog rolled thick from the river, using the grey veil as both camouflage and weapon. 7 victims had fallen to this predator's methodical hunting, each discovery more haunting than the last. Not the frenzied work of a madman, but the calculated precision of someone who understood the city's rhythms as intimately as a composer knows his symphony. Caldwell turned down a narrow passage that connected Dorset Street to the maze of courtyards beyond. The cobblestones beneath his feet were slick with moisture that seemed to seep from the very air itself. Gas flames guttered in their iron brackets, struggling against the suffocating embrace of the fog. The inspector's hand rested on the handle of his truncheon, though he knew such conventional weapons would prove inadequate against a killer who had evaded Scotland Yard's finest minds for months. The first victim had been discovered on a morning in August, when the fog had lifted to reveal Margaret Whitmore collapsed in the doorway of a chandler's shop. The physician's examination revealed no obvious wounds, no signs of struggle, no indication of how a healthy woman of 35 years had simply ceased to breathe. The second victim, found a week later under similar circumstances, had prompted the formation of the Special Investigation Unit that brought Caldwell into the case. Thomas Reeves, a lamplighter who knew every street in Whitechapel, had been found seated on a bench as if he had simply decided to rest during his nightly rounds. As the weeks passed and more bodies appeared, always discovered after particularly heavy fog, the newspapers began to take notice. The Morning Chronicle coined the phrase that would haunt London through the autumn months, dubbing the unknown perpetrator the Fog Killer, in headlines that sold papers faster than printers could produce them. The Illustrated Police News ran sensational drawings of shrouded figures stalking through misty streets, while more respectable publications like The Times called for increased police patrols in the affected areas. Caldwell had studied each crime scene with the methodical thoroughness that had earned him his reputation at Scotland Yard. The victim shared certain characteristics beyond their mysterious deaths. All had been found in areas where the fog gathered most thickly, usually near the river or in the low-lying courts where mist pooled like stagnant water. All had died without apparent struggle, their faces bearing expressions of curious peace rather than terror. Most disturbing of all, each victim had been discovered with their pockets turned inside out, though nothing of value appeared to have been taken. The inspector paused at the entrance to Miller's Court, a cramped square surrounded by decaying tenements that housed some of Whitechapel's most desperate residents. The fog here seemed almost solid, pressing against him with tangible weight. Gaslight from the few working lamps created ghostly halos that revealed nothing beyond their immediate sphere. Caldwell could hear the distant sound of voices, muffled conversations drifting from open windows where families huddled together against both the cold and the fear that had settled over their neighbourhood. He had spent countless hours interviewing witnesses, though their accounts varied wildly and often contradicted each other. Some spoke of seeing a tall figure in a dark coat moving through the fog with unnatural silence. Others described hearing footsteps that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the killer possessed the ability to be in several places simultaneously. A flower seller named Mary Connor swore she had seen a man dissolve into mist before her very eyes, though she admitted to having consumed a considerable quantity of gin that evening. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the keeper of a lodging house on Thrall Street, had approached Caldwell 3 days earlier with information she claimed would solve the case. The elderly woman, whose reputation for sharp observation and careful record-keeping was well known throughout the district, had noticed something that escaped the attention of Scotland Yard's finest investigators. Each victim, according to Mrs. Hartwell's meticulous notes, had visited her establishment within the week preceding their death, not as lodgers, but as individuals making inquiries about a particular room that had remained vacant for over a year. The room in question occupied the top floor of the lodging house, accessible only by a narrow staircase that creaked with every footstep. Mrs. Hartwell had preserved the chamber exactly as its previous occupant had left it, waiting for relatives who never came to claim the modest possessions left behind. The previous tenant had been one Dr. Silas Whitmore, a physician who specialised in diseases of the respiratory system. His particular area of expertise involved the effects of London's increasingly polluted air on human health, and he had conducted extensive research into the relationship between atmospheric conditions and sudden death. Dr. Whitmore had disappeared on a particularly foggy night in July, leaving behind his medical instruments, his extensive library, and notebooks filled with observations about the killer properties of London's toxic fog. Caldwell had examined those notebooks with growing fascination and horror. Dr. Whitmore's research had led him to develop a theory about the fog itself as a delivery system for poison. The physician believed that certain chemical compounds, when released into heavily polluted air, could create a deadly mixture that killed silently and left few traces. His final entries described successful experiments, with compounds that could induce respiratory failure, while leaving victims appearing to have died peacefully in their sleep. The inspector now understood that he was not hunting a conventional killer, but a man who had weaponized London's own atmosphere against its citizens. Dr. Whitmore had not disappeared, but had instead begun using his knowledge to commit the perfect murders, killing randomly selected victims as test subjects for his deadly innovations. The fog provided both the medium for his poison and the cover for his activities, transforming him from respected physician into London's most elusive predator. As Caldwell climbed the stairs to Mrs. Hartwell's lodging house, each step seemed to echo through the building like a funeral bell. The elderly woman met him at the door, a face grave with the understanding of what his visit meant. She led him through narrow corridors that smelled of carbolic acid and human desperation, past doors behind which families huddled together against the night and the fear that had consumed their world. The room on the top floor remained exactly as Dr. Whitmore had left it. Glass bottles containing mysterious compounds lined shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Complex apparatus for distilling and mixing chemicals occupied a workbench beneath windows that looked out over the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. Most disturbing of all, detailed maps of the district covered the walls, marked with red pins that corresponded exactly to the locations where victims had been found. Caldwell examined the apparatus with growing understanding of the killer's methodology. Dr. Whitmore had created a portable system for dispersing his deadly compounds into the fog itself, using London's own weather patterns to deliver poison to carefully selected targets. The victims had not been chosen randomly, but had instead been selected for their predictable movements through areas where the fog gathered most densely. The inspector found Dr. Whitmore's final journal entry dated just 3 days earlier. The physician had grown increasingly paranoid about discovery, convinced that Scotland Yard was closing in on his operation. His handwriting, once precise and methodical, had deteriorated into an almost illegible scrawl that spoke of a mind pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity. The final words were particularly chilling. "The fog has become my ally, my weapon, and my shroud. When they come for me, I shall disappear into the mist that gave me power, and London will never know how close it came to having its very air turned against it." As if summoned by those words, Caldwell heard footsteps on the stairs below, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to match the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The inspector moved to the window and peered through the glass into the fog-wrapped street. A figure moved through the mist with the fluid grace of someone intimately familiar with every shadow and hiding place in the district. Dr. Whitmore was returning to his laboratory, perhaps for the final time. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Dr. Whitmore entered his chamber to find Inspector Caldwell waiting beside the workbench, surrounded by the evidence of months of careful planning and methodical murder. The physician showed no surprise at discovery, but instead smiled with the serene expression of a man who had accepted his fate long before it arrived. The fog killer was a small man, unremarkable in appearance except for eyes that held the peculiar intensity of someone who had stared too long into the abyss of human mortality. His clothes were expensive but worn, marking him as a member of the professional class who had fallen on difficult times. He moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling dangerous materials, and his voice, when he finally spoke, carried the cultured accent of a man educated at one of England's finest universities. Dr. Whitmore made no attempt to deny his crimes or justify his actions beyond explaining his fascination with the fog as both natural phenomenon and potential weapon. He had begun his research with legitimate scientific purposes, studying the effects of London's increasingly polluted atmosphere on public health. The transition from researcher to killer had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as his experiments grew more ambitious and his subjects shifted from laboratory animals to human beings. The physician had selected his victims through careful observation of their daily routines, choosing individuals whose deaths would attract minimal attention from authorities already overwhelmed by the daily toll of poverty and disease in London's worst districts. Each murder had been conducted as a scientific experiment, with detailed notes recording the effects of different compounds under varying atmospheric conditions. As dawn began to penetrate the fog outside, Dr. Whitmore made his final preparations. He moved to his workbench and began combining chemicals with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same actions dozens of times before. Caldwell watched in growing alarm as the physician prepared what appeared to be a concentrated version of the compounds he had been dispersing through the fog. The killer's final words were delivered in the calm, measured tone of a university lecturer addressing his students. He spoke of London's fog as a living entity, a grey god that demanded sacrifice and rewarded those who understood its true nature. The city's atmosphere had become his collaborator in death, transforming him from mere mortal into something approaching divine power over life and death itself. Dr. Whitmore raised the vial containing his final creation and spoke directly to Inspector Caldwell with something approaching gratitude. The investigation had provided him with a worthy opponent, someone who possessed the intelligence and persistence necessary to unravel his carefully constructed web of deception. The game had reached its inevitable conclusion, and both players understood that only one ending was possible. The grey surrender came quietly, without drama or struggle. Dr. Whitmore consumed his own poison with the same methodical precision he had used to dispatch his victims, and the fog killer's reign of terror ended as silently as it had begun. His body settled into the chair beside his workbench, surrounded by the instruments of his craft and the evidence of his crimes. Inspector Caldwell remained in the chamber as morning light gradually burned away the fog that had served as the killer's accomplice. The street below slowly revealed itself, emerging from grey obscurity like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Windows opened in surrounding buildings as residents began their daily routines, unaware that the nightmare that had haunted their community for months had finally ended. The official reports would describe the case in terms that satisfied public curiosity without revealing the full extent of Dr. Whitmore's innovations. Scotland Yard had no desire to inspire imitators by publishing detailed accounts of how London's fog could be weaponized against its own citizens. The physician's apparatus was quietly destroyed, his notes burned, and his victims finally laid to rest with the knowledge that their killer would claim no more lives. London's fog continued to roll in from the Thames as it had for centuries, carrying the scent of coal smoke and river water through streets where millions lived and worked and died in the great experiment of urban civilization. The grey mist that had served as accomplice to murder returned to its ancient role as merely another aspect of the city's complex relationship with the natural world. The candle burned low in Mrs. Hartwell's lodging house as Inspector Caldwell completed his final report. The chamber fell silent except for the distant whisper of fog rolling through empty streets, and history once again turned the page in the dark.